with the Bird Polar and Climate Research Center. And third, part of the State Climate Office of Ohio. So we do have a climate office for those that may not be aware. We like to call ourselves SCOO. It's easy and kind of easy and cheesy, but easy to remember. So yeah, and the cover photo today is just a recent photogenic thunderstorm that developed to drop some small hail across western Ohio. A little bit of damage to crops, but nothing too hateful. But I think as we've turned the page now from spring into summer, it's just a nice picture to capture that.
Hey, and Aaron, I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
I'm sorry I dropped off. I have no idea why. Again, this is one of those wonderful computer things. I just wanted to say thanks for doing this and take it away. So. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so some general information. Obviously, this is a collaborative activity between a lot of centers, NOAA, NCEI, and DOUG, National Weather Service, NIDIS, CPC, and others. The Climate Hubs, USDA Climate Hubs, American Association of State Climatologists, the Regional Climate Centers, the Midwest and High Plains, and the National Drought Mitigation Center. Obviously, for those that have joined us in the past, this is a regular thing on the third Thursday of every month. The next one up is on the 20th of July. And it will be presented by Jeff Andreessen from the Michigan State Climatologist. Doug would also like me to remind folks or let folks know that there will be a Northern Plains Drought Information Call next Wednesday, the 21st of June at 10 a.m. Really, this is to attract tribal, state, local government, as well as ranchers, farmers, and other sectors to come to and talk about the obviously the area being impacted across the Northern Plains with the drought conditions there. You can access the future climate webinars and information with these links, and like Doug said, we'll have some question time at the end.
Hey, Aaron, what I might do is stick it in the chat of this conversation how to sign up for that if I can figure out how to do that. Otherwise, people can contact me if they want to get that information on how to get on that webinar. Thanks.
Okay, terrific. Yeah, so the agenda today, we certainly have a full plate of things, and as usual, we do the recap this last month, May 2017, as well as the March to May conditions. Look at some more of the recent and current conditions and their impacts then in the ag sector, on snow and water, and some other impacts. And then we'll end with the climate outlooks, both from the near-term and long-term perspectives, as well as INSO moving forward. All right, so to begin with the recap, looking at the statewide average temperature ranks for May of 2017, I think it's clear to see across much of the north central region, mostly the white shading here in the map indicating near average temperatures compared to the long-term record here, so near average conditions across much of the north central region. This is a little bit different than what we had experienced throughout the springtime with the very warm weather we had in April. We did see above average conditions in Montana and below average conditions there in Kansas, but in general, close to the long-term average here in terms of ranking. And this was very similar to the contiguous U.S., kind of ranked near the middle of the 123-year period. Looking at differences between the temperature ranks with highs versus lows, so not a lot of change here. They're cooler than a little bit cooler in terms of temperature, daytime highs in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Colorado. Above average across North Dakota and Montana and the rest of the central U.S. looking at near average conditions, and then near average ranks. And then if you look at the nighttime lows, the one that sticks out really is Ohio with above average. It was certainly a wet month here, so that played into it, and then below average there in Kansas as well. So as far as the precipitation recap for the month of May, it's really above average across the eastern and southern stretches of this region. You can see many of the states at least approaching top 10 or top 20 wettest for the statewide precipitation ranks for May 2017. Just the opposite of that across the northern plains there from Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, below average in terms of the state precipitation ranks across those states. This was the 25th wettest on record for the U.S., tying 2009, and in general, most of the central and eastern part of the north central region was above average. So now looking at the meteorological spring here, the March to May ranks. Again, we've got the warm colors for this period, so above average to much above average across the entire north central region. So states like Ohio and Indiana, much above, along with Colorado and Wyoming. The rest of the states in our region above average as well. And this was despite that sort of middle of the rank month of May. So the really warm conditions in some of the states in March and obviously in April really weighed heavily here. In terms of the precipitation, again, the very wet spring for many of us, from Kansas to Missouri, Illinois, up to Wisconsin and in the eastern Corn Belt and Michigan as well. So these are close to or top 10 and even top 5 in some cases. So if you look at the wet conditions here in Kansas and Missouri, these are very wet March to May ranks. And again, just opposite of that, the very dry conditions that have crept up very rapidly across the northern plains, with North Dakota seeing now the 9th driest on record for this long-term period. All right, so let's go ahead and move then to the more recent and current conditions. We'll start out with the last 30 days in the temperature ranks. The graph is showing the departure from normal temperature from mid-May to mid-June. There are some regions that we saw cooler than average temperatures, from parts of Colorado and southeast Wyoming into northwest Nebraska, and also in the upper Midwest, say northern Minnesota, some parts of northern Wisconsin and northern Michigan. But overall, the plot's really showing a lot of warmer than average temperatures over the last 30 days from eastern Nebraska and Kansas, eastward through Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and also Wisconsin and Michigan. Some of the anomalies here are approaching 3 or 4 degrees Fahrenheit in some locales from Ohio, Michigan. And then again, these very warm conditions also being experienced across eastern Montana or large portions of Montana, northern stretches of Wyoming, South Dakota here, and much of North Dakota as well. So we're going to see that, again, if you joined us last month, where April temperatures were sort of being tempered, we've now switched to very warm conditions across the north central region. And ultimately, this is part of the role then that's impacting the moisture availability for the north central region. Looking at the last 30 days of precipitation, I've put 2 graphs here from the High Plains Regional Climate Center. So we're looking at raw precipitation in inches in the upper left for the 30 days, and then the percent of normal in the bottom right. So we do have this bullseye precipitation across northern Wisconsin, where in excess of 8 inches has fallen in the last 30 days. And there's some wetter, if you look at the bottom right panel, you can see that's 1.5 to maybe as much as 3 times the normal amount of precipitation for that period. And there's some other local wetter conditions as well. If you look at, say, across northern Colorado into northwest Nebraska, across northern Kansas, and then again parts of Minnesota into the UP of Michigan. Critically dry conditions across Montana, we can see that in the amount of precipitation that's falling, and more so in the percent of normal. So some of these percent of normals are dropping below 25 and even 5% in this region. From Montana, North Dakota, and into South Dakota, a lot of impacts that are occurring and ongoing up here. The other area that I really want to point out today is this area developing in northern Missouri, also into southern Iowa, and extending into parts of Illinois and southern Indiana, and perhaps even parts of Ohio. So this area is really drying out rapidly over the last 1 to 2 weeks here, and we're going to see this theme repeated throughout the presentation today. So one of the charts, the graphs that's used in the webinar here is looking at the total column soil moisture anomaly. This is a modeled product, and this is anomaly in millimeters. And it's so anywhere we see the blue shading, we can see the soil moisture is in surplus of average conditions here. So we can see the soil moisture is quite moist across Kansas, parts of Colorado, the Intermountain West as well. The area here across northern Minnesota and the UP of Michigan is also showing the blue shading, so the soil moisture is adequate here. And again, we're looking at soil moisture negative anomalies across South Dakota, very much so across North Dakota and northwest Minnesota. and this other area that's now developing across northern Minnesota, northern Missouri, southern Iowa, and stretching into central parts of Illinois. So with these dry conditions happening in a couple of locations, I decided to put a couple of plots just to deal with some of the stress that's happening. This is the evaporative stress index, just looking at comparison between evapotranspiration and the potential. One of the good things about the ESI is it's really high resolution, so 4-kilometer resolution here, but it can be contaminated a little bit by clouds. But anyway, I think it's clear the stress, the ESI, very low across the Dakotas, eastern Montana, parts of northwest Minnesota, as I've been repeating here. And then again, this other area that's developing in northern Missouri, across Illinois and Iowa, and really it shows that these areas are anomalously high rates of water use across the land. So a lot of evaporative demand here, leading to these very low numbers in the evaporative stress. Another tool I decided to display this week is the Quick Dry. So this is a large-scale collaborative effort from researchers from the National Drought Mitigation Center and Nebraska-Lincoln, USDA, USGS, and others. Really the model, it is a model product to incorporate multiple remote sensing and climate-based inputs. But the good thing, the thing that it really serves is kind of a drought alarm. So it's designed with the improved sensitivity to early stage drought conditions. And so we can see this evolution from May 28th through June 11th on the panels here. The dry conditions were already evident across the northern plains, northwest Minnesota here on the 28th, intensified here by June 4th, and really has remained close to that in the more recent period up to June 11th. And I wanted to use it again to show this area here in northern Missouri and Iowa, where the conditions are rapidly, the stress is rapidly increasing in this region, again due to the high evaporative demand. And as Paganon and the state climatologist in Missouri points out, this is very a very rapidly responding area to these dry conditions because of the high clay soils here. And since there's been very strong evaporative demand in this region, the conditions are drying out quickly. So it really emphasizes both the areas of dryness that we're watching across the region. So to contrast that then, let's go ahead and look at the 24-day average stream flow. I'll start with where stream flows are still high. So we have some very high flows out here in western Wyoming, and I'm going to show you some great photos of that here in just a moment. We got high stream flows from northern Kansas into western Iowa and across southern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin, and some smaller areas here in southern Missouri, northeast Indiana, across western Ohio. Again, note where the stream flows are quite low, so we're seeing that across the Dakotas and parts of eastern Montana that match up with the precipitation deficits and also the impacts that we're seeing. And that stretches also in the northwest Minnesota. And then this region here across northern Missouri, again, that's responding very quickly to the high evaporative demand, those high clay soils, clay soil content there that's really dropping those stream flows quite quickly. So it really matches up with the products showing the drought stress on the previous slides. So all of this is to say, today the new U.S. Drought Monitor was released, and this map looks quite different than it did a month ago. And you're going to see that the changes were very rapid. So we can see the current conditions in terms of no drought or no dryness have decreased from last week, and then we've seen a bump up in the D0 to D4 conditions, as well as the D1 to D4 and D2 to D4. So we can see that conditions have deteriorated rapidly across central North Dakota and north central South Dakota, much of those states in fact, but we've got D2 severe drought conditions already on the U.S. monitor there, and also here in eastern Montana, stretching up into northwest Minnesota. We've also had this rapidly deteriorating region across northern Missouri, so we've got D1 moderate drought conditions now for several counties there in Missouri that line up with those very low stream flows, again, and some dryness that's extending from Iowa across northern Illinois into Michigan and across the central part of those states into southern Ohio as well. And I think it's really dramatic to look at the 1-month change map from the U.S. Drought Monitor release this morning, showing some of these regions have, in just 1 month, we've seen a 3-class degradation in the drought conditions here across eastern Montana, parts of North Dakota, and much of the area in this region, a 2-class degradation in the U.S. Drought Monitor. And we're really there's numerous ag impacts from this as well. And also, again, this area down here where we've seen quickly intensifying drought conditions across northern Missouri. We did see some improvement across central Colorado and other parts of Colorado, and a little bit here in Wyoming, so that is good news there. But we've got a lot more drought conditions overall across the north central region. All right, so let's move on to the impacts that we're feeling then from all of this that's happening. And I've had to really pick and choose which photos. There's a ton of photos coming out from the north central region on this. This is really a dichotomous picture of the dry conditions that are happening up in the northern plains on the left. So these are winter wheat conditions, and this is courtesy of Laura Edwards, the South Dakota State climatologist, looking at those deteriorating conditions for plants up there and grasses. On the right, it's really a picture of some sidewall compaction issues that we're seeing across the Corn Belt. And there's multiple factors that go into that, not just the wet soils, but also when and how corn and different plants were planted and the timing. So a lot of different impacts that are happening across the region. If we look at soil temperatures, obviously these have surged and are quite warm throughout the middle part of the country, extending up into Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio as well. We do have the area across northern Wisconsin where soils are very wet. We've had that precipitation bullseye in terms of in excess of 8 inches there, with still having cool soil for the 4-inch bear. The NASS topsoil moisture, again, this is a picture that's drastically changed from last month. So we were looking at a lot of single-digit % short to very short topsoil moisture during middle of May. Now, just the changes from 1 week here, we're looking at 20 to 30% changes across much of the region here across the southern tier of the north central region, and even across the Dakotas and Montana, which were already showing short to very short moisture. Those have increased as well. So we've got a wide swath over much of the region with short to very short soil moisture. Just the opposite of that, the blue shadings here across the eastern Corn Belt we had last month with the % surplus have disappeared, and a lot of the surplus are now in the single digits. Again, big changes from the previous week. Getting into some of the progress of plants. So as a percentage nationwide, we've passed that 95% threshold on June 4th. So I'm just showing the % emerged. Again, across parts of the north central, we somewhat ahead of schedule here across the Dakotas from the early season conditions that were a little bit more favorable, obviously, where it was extremely wet across Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, Wisconsin, and Michigan, falling a little bit behind, but not too much really, maybe a little bit more here in Michigan in terms of the corn that has emerged. Looking at soybeans, kind of a similar story. So most of the north central region, a little bit ahead of schedule compared to in terms of % planted and also emerged. But if you're looking at those states that have been a little bit wetter, quite wet actually, those are change from the 5-year is down a bit. So we get reports out of southern Indiana that a lot of the farmers are either replanting twice this season because of the wet conditions, and certainly a lot of times when they're planting corn, they wait until corn is planted to plant the soybeans, and that has a ripple effect there. Winter wheat, I just wanted to show this to show that the harvesting has begun here across Illinois and into Indiana for the winter wheat. Really the ugliest slide that I have to present today is in this U.S. spring wheat conditions. And so I think this is just one of those large impacts from what's happening across the northern plains. In terms of the % emerged, early season conditions allowed that to happen. However, if you look at the % here in the upper right for good to excellent conditions, compared to change from last year, these are drastically lower, very, very much lower than last year. Again, these slides are courtesy of Brad Rippey at the USDA Office of Chief Economist. And there's this slide here on the upper left just showing how much worse 2017 started the spring wheat condition index is compared to the recent years. So we're really bad start here in terms of the U.S. spring wheat conditions across the northern plains. And the same can be said for pastures and oats, where the conditions up here in the northern plains are really depleted compared to last year. Pasture across much of this other region is faring a bit better, along with the oats here in the southern sections of the growth zone. As far as sorghum goes, South Dakota is showing this big change from last year again because of the conditions, but elsewhere across the central, we're looking about where we should be. So we had a lot of, really I would say, a plethora of impacts coming in on the ag side of things. So what I've tried to do is break these down into a regional northern tier and a southern tier, and I would call the northern tier this rapid drought development that we've seen. And so kind of to distill the message down, what we're looking at, some of the bigger impacts here coming out of this region, we're looking at cattle being sold quite earnestly. And Laura Edwards has told us that, you know, it's both yearlings that would normally go to feed at this time, but also cow-calf pairs. So that indicates herd culling, where there's just not enough feed there for the livestock. And so that's a big indicator of the impacts that are hitting very quickly there. Winter wheats being cut for hay instead of harvesting for grain, alfalfa not being cut. Burn bans across the Dakotas. South Dakota has initiated the State Drought Task Force within the recent period. The Fort Peck tribe has prepared a disaster declaration for drought conditions that are happening on the reservation there in Montana. Into northern Minnesota, a lot of things we're dealing with heat stress from rapid loss of soil moisture. There was a cool May there, and a little bit of a cool May in Minnesota, but indications are there was really no fruit damage or anything from that, but mostly just the heat stress from the rapid soil moisture loss. Across the southern tier of counties, really it's a story about going from wet to hot and dry. And I put, you know, a question, do we have this drought looming? Obviously it's developed in northern Missouri, so it's more than just looming at this point. But what is it like moving forward? As far as conditions go, where corn was planted on time and it wasn't too wet, conditions are good. And the heat can even help, obviously, develop deeper roots. But anybody having to plant late, soybean late, they're really struggling with some of the heat stress. There is some rolling, which can be expected and isn't unusual. But we got reports from Pat out of Missouri of some turning yellow because of potassium uptake issues. Again, the sidewall compaction issues, soil crusting and soybeans breaking necks to try to emerge. Some no water in some cases for germination for soybeans and pumpkins. And there will be a concern for additional stress on irrigation and nurseries if the dryness continues. Switching over to impacts on water and snow, so I got some great photos from Wendy Kelly out of Wyoming. This is a Cliff Creek flowing into the Hoback River in western Wyoming, that rich chocolate milk kind of color. You know, the rapid runoff from snowmelt there. There is some flooding that's taking place, so this picture below it is from the New Fork River in Sublette County in western Wyoming on June 8th. The river clearly out of its banks there. And then a snapshot of the western Lake Erie Basin as well. Some heavy rain fell over Memorial Day weekend in the Maumee River drainage. We have a nice photo showing the sediment plume into that part of the lake. So a slide on the Great Lake water levels. They're running quite high for this year compared to last year and the long-term average, and we can see that in the plot here on the right in all the 5 lakes here. Lake Erie, in particular, the water levels are the highest since 1998. There's been some complaints about rising water levels along beaches and piers there, but not really too much in the way of damage. One of the things that we try to keep an eye on in terms of the western Lake Erie Basin is the harmful algal bloom projections. So because it's been a very wet May across the Maumee River Basin, the total bioavailable phosphorus is running high, higher than some of the mid-season expected loads, and so The projection is to have kind of a mild bloom severity in terms of the harmful algal blooms, and that does have an impact on recreation and could possibly have an impact on water as well. So turning to the NRCS snow water equivalent map, the SNOTEL SWE here. So we'll start in the north with Montana, greater than average, above or close to 150%, above 130 here across the northwest. Remaining across the southern part of the state, that's dropping very rapidly, and we're getting down quite low here in a couple of the areas. If we turn to Wyoming, again, we have a lot of snow in the Wind River Mountains. There's indications of at least 8 feet still remaining at some of the higher elevations above 10,000 feet, but snow is coming off the Teton Mountains pretty quickly. Like the photos I showed, the rivers are full and raging, and there is some flooding, but the indication is it's not as bad as years past. And the livestock turnout dates onto some of the forest land is being delayed because of snow still coming off and the forage not available. Farther south into Colorado, the cooler May sort of delayed the snow melt there, but it's still in full swing. Conditions are good. The reservoirs and lakes are filling up, so there's not too much concern across this region. Turning to the snowpack SWE, so the amount total above Fort Peck, about 14% of the peak still remains. We can see here from the blue curve rapidly coming to a close in terms of the amount of SWE remaining in these basins. The total Fort Peck to Garrison, about 19% of the peak, about 4 inches remaining here, so that is a little bit above average in that part, but not much. Pretty close to the seasonal average and quickly coming to a close there. With the Platte River Basin, again, following along with the seasonal progression, about 16% of the peak SWE remaining for the North Platte, and 9% remaining for the South Platte. So these are again, coming to a close where we're getting down close to zero here in the next couple of months. Some other issues that are coming up. So may have seen the story about the North Dakota State Ag Commissioner's desire to open up these Conservation Reserve Program lands. This obviously is a problem when you're dealing with pheasants nesting, and transition of these lands will be slow and not expected till probably late July or early August. But there's a lot of concern here about how to feed the cattle, and obviously with a lot of the cattle sales going on, that's really indicative of the problem. We could ask the question about fire risk across the northern plains. Right now there's no large events, but we are getting past the precipitation peak, so there could be an opportunity for the opportunity for improvement would likely be diminishing on a general sense. We'll see what the outlooks say here, but certainly it's something to keep in mind as we move forward. Some other issues, we got nice pictures from Pat, Missouri, showing the turf turning brown. There was a local very extreme heavy rain event in southern Indiana back in May 19th, so a day after the last webinar. The river there, the Blue River, Salem, rose 9 feet per hour just before the equipment maxed out, so that caused millions of dollars of damage on that in that locale. Again, Wisconsin's so wet, there's concern getting the plants in the ground, and some impacts out of Michigan because of the May 8th and 9th freeze. There is indication of some injury there, but it varies very widely. All right, so let's turn to the outlooks then. The question of the El Nino. So this is an oldie but a goodie, I think, in terms of what we can expect. Just going to run through 7-day precipitation, some river flood, 8 to 14 day outlook, get into INSO predictions, and then try to go through this as quickly but succinctly as possible. So the 7-day QPF forecast, again, one of the areas we're looking at northern Missouri, southern Iowa, northern Illinois here. So if the QPF does pan out over the next 7 days, this could help alleviate the drying conditions that have been taking place here. Unfortunately, not a lot of precipitation from eastern Montana down into South Dakota, and so that could exacerbate some of the conditions that are happening up there. Elsewhere across the region, we're looking at probably close to normal precip if the QPF verifies. Not surprisingly, with a lot of the areas seeing warmer and drier conditions, there's no real significant river flood expected through the next 7 days or so. I just wanted to put that in there to reflect those conditions. In terms of the 8 to 14 day temperature and precipitation probabilities, this runs for the 22nd of June through the 28th. Generally, it reflects a weak ridging troughing pattern across the U.S. So it favors kind of a faster flow, zonal flow across the U.S. from west to east. So temperatures are going to align with this north-south gradient. So we think across the northern tier, there's a greater probability of below normal temperatures, equal chances across southern Montana, Dakotas, and parts of the central part and into Ohio, and then greater than 33 or 40% of seeing above normal temperatures across the southern sections. With this weak ridge here, we'll see a lot of perhaps shortwave activity quickly moving by, so the chances of precipitation in the eastern sections is a little bit greater than it would otherwise be. Looking at the INSO conditions, we've seen this kind of go from, we think El Nino is likely to occur, to kind of equal chance with neutral conditions, and now we're seeing that neutral conditions are favored over El Nino conditions, which is only about 35% in the upcoming fall and winter season. So right now the consensus is we're looking at neutral conditions through the remainder of 2017 and into the winter of 2018. So that really doesn't, in terms of the long-term forecast then, there's really this lack of strong climate mode. So the July temperature and precipitation probabilities, widespread greater than 33 or 40% probability of above normal temperatures, except here in parts of Montana where it's equal chances. And this is just based really on the model ensemble and influence of decadal timescales. So without really the INSO push or any of the strong climate modes, we're looking at the likelihood above average temperatures here. As far as precipitation, there is a little bit of an indication of a greater probability of above normal precipitation across Montana and western North Dakota. It's relatively weak and doesn't really exceed 40% in many areas. Conversely, across Colorado and Wyoming, there is an increased probability of below normal precipitation with equal chances throughout the remainder of the north central region. If we go out to the 3-month temperature, it's very similar to July, so we're looking at mostly higher probabilities of above average temperatures with equal chances there in Montana, but decreasing or increasing chances of above normal precipitation across the northern sections, the northern plains, Montana, and the Dakotas as well. So that could be good news to help alleviate some of the drought conditions that we're seeing throughout the summer. Equal chances are likely of above, below, and near neutral or near average for the remainder part of the central U.S. And so that equates to the drought outlook here. We're looking at northern plains persistence in many of these regions throughout the season. So despite the above normal or the greater probability of above normal precip, we're still looking at persistence here in a lot of the regions, but some removal likely in some of the regions of this. So it's kind of a mixed signal, a mixed idea here across the northern plains. In northern Missouri, that's like drought removal likely according to this outlook, probably based on the QPF that's expected over the next week or two in the general pattern. So I'll briefly, the summary of conditions, kind of split these again in the rapid development of drought across the northern plains and northwest Minnesota. A lot of impacts. I encourage checking out the USDA Midwest Climate Hub for a lot more details on those. There has been some relief in the precipitation this week, but we'll see if that continues. We've had this rapid transition from cool, wet to hot, dry conditions across the central and eastern Corn Belt with issues related to that as well. In terms of the outlook, I think the big story is El Nino not likely to occur through northern hemisphere winter. So warmer conditions are likely for the whole region this summer based on just long-term decadal trends and some antecedent soil moisture as well. So with that, I think I want to go ahead and close since I'm going a bit over time here, and just let everyone know that today and past recorded presentations are available at the links provided. Again, a lot of collaboration with the National Climatic Data Center, the CPC, the Drought Portal, the National Drought Mitigation Center, state climatologists, and the regional climate centers. So thank you, and thank you for bearing with me for this first trip down the drought webinar. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. We do have a couple of questions, but before we get to them, a couple things I wanted to help point out is, and maybe you can talk a little bit more about them, or Dennis, since we can get on or off the phone as easily as possible. May and June are critical growing season precipitation periods across much of the north central part of the U.S. Yes. I wanted to point that out in that if we miss, if you will, precipitation in some regions, you're talking about having to make that up in July and August, which is really tough in most years. Now, last year was different than that. The rain actually turned on for a large area of the Midwest during that period. So this isn't really a question; it's more of a comment that I wanted to make. The other thing I'd like to say is, and I think Adnan, if you're still on, North Dakota and South Dakota have initiated their state drought groups. And if anybody's interested, in the chat section of the webinar is where I put the Adobe Connect information for the sub-regional or regional, whatever you want to call it, the Dakotas and Montana sort of discussion next week of drought in that region. So you can look at that, the chat section. Hopefully you can grab that and participate if you want to. And again, it's not going to be about any other. It's not really going to be about any other region other than the Dakotas and Montana. And we'll have localized folks talk about that, as well as a discussion of the drought monitor and how that gets put together. We have a lot of questions about that, especially during dry times, on what goes into it, how can I participate, and all that kind of stuff. So I wanted to say those things, and I guess that's it, other than a couple of questions here. Let me see if Adnan has anything he wants to add. Stand by, Adnan. I'm going to try to... there you go. Yeah,
can you hear me
now?
Yeah.
Anything you want to add?
Yeah, we just
had
North
Dakota.
Yep, North Dakota. We just had a state drought/wildfire collaboration team meeting with the state, and I took some notes. Basically, it is really the drought perspective and plus the burn bans. And Aaron mentioned some of the counties. To be exact, the governor declared the burn ban in the 30 counties, and North Dakota has only 51. Meaning that more than 50% of the area in North Dakota is experiencing burn ban. And timely rain versus not timely rain discussion Doug mentioned earlier, and some of the agronomists I talked in here is really hopeful, still hopeful that timely the rain can still get us out of further damage in the eastern North Dakota, but the western North Dakota, it seems like things are too late, because it is not only the small grain problem. We always thought the reason why the small grains are so short is the drought stress, led by the lack of what am I thinking? The photosynthesis, which is needed to enhance the growth rate. And also, I noticed from the call from the Department of Ag that it is not only small grain problem, but also the row crops too. I've seen some pictures that the row crops are not germinating, and fields are indicating a lot of gaps, and more gaps than the plants. So the further rain is not going to help, but and there was an agreement that the recent rains was needed, and additional moist will be needed to carry the crops through flowering and grain fill. And some of the other things we talked is the limited waters in the dugouts increase the particulate concentration ratio, creating the water quality problems for the cattle. And Aaron mentioned that how many kettles are being sold in South Dakota and North Dakota. And if I wanted to add one more thing, that the Ag Commissioner opened hay hotline, and based on what I know, that hotline is quite busy. That's all I have to add.
Thank you, Adnan. Sorry my phone keeps cutting out. I'm sort of doing this remotely from Boulder, Colorado today and not in Kansas City where I normally am. So if I drop off, I drop off, and we'll just end it then. A couple other questions. How is the dryness affecting crops? I think you covered a lot of that, Aaron, in some because the question was asked very early in the presentation. I wonder if Dennis, you had anything else you wanted to add to what Aaron had to say?
Yeah, I mean, we can't compare to 2012 completely at this point for a couple reasons. It's worse than 2012 further north in the Dakotas because conditions in the Dakotas didn't develop until further into the season. We've had much more of the impact early in the season. What happens with crops is still to be determined by the rest of the season at this point. If things moderate, this hot, dry period in early June could actually be somewhat of a benefit to corn because it's pushed. This is a time when it's developing its root system, and if it has dry conditions, it will push its root system deeper, trying to find moisture and nutrients. So we could end up being a positive. It really depends on what's going to happen after this. The other thing you have to remember is that corn is heavily impacted by what happens in July, its tasseling period, and soybeans are more heavily impacted by what happens in August. So we still have a lot to be determined on the corn and soybean side.
Thanks, Dennis. Say, I wanted to make something a little more clear. We had a comment from Kent Thierer from North Dakota, just pointing out that the 30 county bans that Adnan mentioned are county initiated, and it's not a state ban or declaration at this time, according to Kent. And another question was, a question from Diane Mankleger was, is there something influencing the localized fast-moving storms? And I assume you meant earlier this week, a couple complexes actually moved through North Dakota or to the Dakotas, as well as other states. Anybody want to comment on that?
The question was how quickly storms are moving. Is that what she was asking about?
I mean, I think it was in relationship to showing the 8 to 14 day outlook. So, you know, generally reading the guidance there, we're switching to a pattern where we've got this general weak ridging and troughing pattern across the United States. So it's really more of a zonal flow, a flow from west to east, which tends to be, you know, it tends to keep the storm systems moving along instead of moving slower when you've got an amplified flow across the country. So generally the guidance is on the eastern side of that ridge across the central U.S., there could be numerous shortwave, you know, small systems that move around the eastern part of that ridge, and that's what's giving the greater than 33% probability of above normal precip from Minnesota down through Michigan, Wisconsin, Michigan, northern Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Did I explain that okay?
Yeah, I think so.
Hello. Okay. Questions? Dennis, are you there?
You keep cutting out, Doug.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So, Dennis, are you looking through the questions?
I can't see them.
Oh, you can't see them. Okay, well, storms are coming through at 40 to 70 miles an hour. I think that happens the plains, I guess. There was a question from Jerry Oster that said, as soils dry out, I'm back for what it's worth. Let me see if I can get to these last questions before I hang up again. Sorry. As soils dry out, especially in South and North Dakota, are there chances for a flash drought? And Jerry, I'd say very quickly that this is indicative of a flash drought that we're having right now. It's not, in some cases it's pretty serious. In other places it hasn't become, you know, exceptional or anything. But this is the hot, dry weather, a lot of wind. It doesn't take long for those top layers of soil to dry out and to have impacts, especially on agriculture.
Yeah, I think that's reflected really strongly in the 3-class degradation in 1 month in the U.S. Drought Monitor as well.
Yep. Yeah, if you have any questions on that, some of those tools, some of the things that the evaporative stress index and things like that are very specific to look at flash drought, and where it shows brown and various colors like that is a good indicator that flash drought is occurring.
Doug, can you still hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Adnan.
I wanted to make a comment about the flash drought. In particularly in North Dakota, we had a switch between the wet to dry starting in March. And the previous 6 seasons total was the 9th wettest. And the reason why we did not feel the drought as much as we could have if everything was normal, because we utilized that leftover moisture in the soil that was left over from the previous season. And when the March, April, and May became much drier than normal, 3 months in a row, the farmers still utilized that excessive moisture from the previous season, and we did not really realize the impact of the drought as much as we would normally. And also the cooler temperatures played an important role. And as soon as the temperatures increased and lost that moisture into the air, we started getting into that accelerated impact. That's what we've been experiencing. And you're right, this is the flash drought.
Yeah. There are some indications that some of the warmth for part of the region earlier in the year, especially across let's say, in some of the areas that are being impacted by drought right now, were influenced by warmer than normal winter conditions, which actually evaporates. It doesn't evapotranspirate, but it definitely allows evaporation and use, if you will, of some of that moisture. That's all the questions I have at the moment. Anybody have any final comments? All right. In that case, thank you very much, Aaron, and everybody else on the call. I appreciate you all coming and asking questions, and Aaron for doing the presentation. We'll be back next month with Jeff Andreessen. I forgot the date. Anybody know off the top of their head? 20th of July. 20th of July. So thank you very much, and hope for rain. Have a good day.